November 1944, the icy winds of the Ardennes had already begun to sweep across the bloodied earth. A relentless series of battles had worn down the Allied forces, and the German war machine seemed unyielding. The situation was grim. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, battered but resolute, had fought their way through months of intense combat. Yet, it was not the fierce fighting that would eventually define their place in history. It was the men who had been left behind. Declared unfit for combat by their commanders, at an unassuming medical outpost on the front lines, those words were etched into the records of soldiers who had given everything. The army had written them off. Broken bodies, fractured spirits, and wounds that, on paper, meant they could no longer fight. Yet, these men were about to show the world that defeat is often a temporary condition, and heroism is not always forged in the heat of battle. For weeks, the men sat in makeshift hospitals, the scent of antiseptic clinging to their uniforms as they gazed at the war from a distance. Their faces were drawn, scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. But there was something in their eyes, something the army hadn't seen. They had been told they were no longer fit to fight, but what the army had missed was the most crucial element of warfare. As the war raged on, the situation shifted dramatically. The battle for the Ardennes took a sudden turn as the Allies began to push back. New orders came down the chain of command, and the men now deemed unfit found themselves on a train bound for the heart of the conflict once more. It was a paradox. Soldiers whose strength had been deemed insufficient were being called to perform impossible feats. Their journey would soon take them from the edge of defeat to the pinnacle of valor. In early January 1945, a crisp, cold morning, they rejoined their comrades, who were shocked to see them return. Their appearance had changed. The wounds, though visible, were no longer symbols of weakness, but rather marks of endurance. They had been reborn by sheer determination. As the men of the 101st trudged toward the front, the men who had once been declared unfit would take part in one of the most remarkable moments in military history. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its peak. The Allied forces were pushing forward, but the road ahead was lined with obstacles. The German counteroffensive was relentless. But the soldiers who had once been deemed unfit for combat had now become an embodiment of the human spirit's will to rise from defeat. Their mission was simple: hold the line at all costs. They fought with the ferocity of men who had been denied their place in history, who had been told they weren't good enough to carry on. They held positions for days, without rest, without reinforcements, and often without supplies. Their commanders, still unsure of their readiness, kept them on the fringes. But as each hour passed, these men showed not only their comrades but the world what it meant to fight for survival. The battle that unfolded was nothing short of a testament to their resolve. As the Germans advanced with heavy artillery and ruthless determination, these soldiers, previously sidelined by their own army, returned to the front lines, not with the hesitation of the forgotten, but with the fury of men who had something to prove. The fog of war was thick that winter, the air punctuated by the deafening sounds of artillery and the screams of soldiers on both sides. Yet through it all, these men fought back, not just with weapons, but with a raw, unrelenting drive to claim their place. Every bullet, every grenade, every moment of the brutal hand-to-hand combat that followed became a stepping stone in a story of redemption. Weeks passed, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Reports of their bravery began to circulate among the higher command. Unfit soldiers were now being praised for their unparalleled courage and steadfastness. As the Battle of the Bulge reached its climax, the heroes who had once been written off as incapable had become the lifeblood of the Allied advance. By mid-February, when the German forces finally began their retreat, the men who had been left behind in the dark corners of military hospitals were celebrated as heroes. Their medals, once unlikely, were now justly earned. They were decorated with honors, not for what they had done before, but for what they had done after what they had accomplished when others had doubted them. They had returned, not as the broken men they had once seemed, but as the vanguard of a new era in war. Their story would be immortalized not only as a tale of military achievement, but as a reflection of the profound truth that sometimes the greatest battles are fought after defeat. The army said they were unfit for combat, but history would say something else entirely. And as they stood, once again in the quiet aftermath of battle, medals gleaming on their chests, they knew that they had fought not just for victory, but for their own redemption. Their story, however, was not simply about survival on the battlefield. It was a story of mental and emotional endurance and internal struggle that mirrored the external chaos of war. It was the resilience of men who had been broken, left behind and forgotten, only to rise again and prove their worth not just to their commanders, but to themselves. It began long before their return to the front lines. During their time in the hospitals, many had been told to rest, to recover. The army doctors, weary from months of treating the wounds of countless soldiers, had marked them as unfit, physically and mentally. Yet the soldiers who had been sent to the rear were not broken by their injuries. In the silence of their beds, far from the front, they found a different kind of strength, a psychological resolve that had been born from the shock of war and the pain of their wounds. The men who had been left behind shared stories in the hospital, ward stories of their comrades, their families, their homes that seemed a world away. They had witnessed the brutality of the battlefield and survived the horrors of war that no one should have to endure. Yet, in the silence of their recovery, they began to find something more than physical healing. They began to rebuild the very identity they had lost. They remembered who they were before the war, men with families, dreams, and hopes, as they spoke of their pasts. The men who had been discarded like broken tools began to see their worth again. They were not just soldiers. They were human beings who had endured things most could not even imagine. The army had told them they were unfit, but now they understood that their strength lay not in their ability to fight, but in their refusal to surrender their humanity. And so, when the call came for them to return to the front, they did not hesitate. They understood that they had something to prove, not just to their commanders, but to themselves. They had seen their limits, faced the depths of despair, and yet they had not broken. They had been discarded. They had never truly been defeated. When they arrived back at the front lines in January 1945, they were not the same men who had been sent to the rear months before. They were stronger, more determined, and filled with a quiet resolve that only those who had faced the abyss could understand. As they rejoined their comrades, the shock on the faces of the soldiers who had once served alongside them was palpable. The men who had once been unfit were now the very embodiment of strength. The battle that lay ahead. The Battle of the Bulge was the crucible in which they would prove their worth. In the freezing cold, with the roar of artillery and the scream of incoming shells, these men did not flinch. They held their positions, facing the German assault with unwavering courage. They fought not just with weapons, but with an unbreakable spirit. Each step they took on that snow-covered battlefield was a step towards redemption. A step towards showing the world that they had always been fit. It just needed the chance to prove it. As the days passed and the Allies began to turn the tide, the soldiers who had been written off as unfit for combat emerged as some of the fiercest fighters on the front. Their story became a symbol not just of physical strength, but of the power of the human will. They fought as if they had everything to prove, and in many ways they did. They were fighting for their place in history, for the chance to show that they were not just the men left behind, but the men who would change the course of the war. By the time the German forces began to retreat, these men had earned not just their medals, but the respect of those who had once doubted them. Their bravery became legendary stories of soldiers who had been dismissed as unfit, but had emerged as heroes. Their actions proved that valor is not just a matter of physical ability, but of resilience, mental strength, and an unwavering commitment to duty. The medals they received were not just for their actions on the battlefield. They were for the journey they had made from being unfit for combat to becoming the very symbols of heroism. They had faced the impossible, not just on the front lines, but within themselves, and they had come out victorious. The world would remember them, not as men who had been written off, but as heroes who had fought against the odds and had proven that even in the face of defeat, there is strength to be found in rising again. As the war drew to a close, These men would return to their homes, forever changed by their experiences. But they would carry with them the knowledge that they had done something extraordinary. They had gone from being forgotten soldiers to being the men who had held the line and turned the tide of a war. Their legacy would live on, not just in the medals they wore, but in the story of how they had overcome the greatest challenge of all, the challenge to reclaim their place in the world, and to prove that sometimes the greatest victories are won in the quietest moments. When no one is watching, in the end, their journey would be remembered as a powerful reminder of the strength of the human spirit. The army had told them they were unfit for combat, but they returned as heroes who had not only survived the battlefield but had fought their greatest battle within themselves, and in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the most unlikely soldiers become the greatest of heroes. The journey of these soldiers didn't end with the last battles of the European theater. Their story became a reflection of the profound psychological and emotional toll war takes on the individual. What had been considered a brief moment of weakness, a temporary state of unfitness, had transformed into an enduring testament to resilience and personal growth. Under extreme circumstances, as the men returned home, many were greeted as heroes, their names forever etched in the annals of military history. Yet, despite the acclaim, there was something deeper, something less tangible, that would linger with them long after the medals had been pinned to their chests. The truth was, these soldiers had faced far more than the enemy's gunfire. They had faced the battle within. Reintegration into civilian life. After the war was a struggle for most veterans. But for these men, there was a distinct challenge that few of their comrades would fully understand. The trauma of being declared unfit for combat. Of being discarded when they were most vulnerable, left a mark that went beyond physical scars. They had been rejected by their own system. Told they weren't worthy, yet through sheer willpower. They had redeemed themselves not only in battle, but in the eyes of those who had once turned away in the years that followed. Many of these men became the foundation of post-war America's industrial boom. Some returned to work in factories, using the skills they had learned in combat to build the machines of peace. Others turned to agriculture, putting the discipline they had gained on the front lines to work in fields that had once been ravaged by the war. But in all of them, there was a quiet sense of pride, not just for what they had accomplished, but for what they had overcome. It was in the quiet moments, away from the spotlight, that their transformation was most evident. They had returned home not as men broken by the war, but as individuals who had redefined their own sense of identity. They had been discarded, deemed unfit, and yet they had risen from the ashes of that judgment to prove that there was no such thing as being unfit for combat when the battle was for survival, for self-worth, and for the very essence of the human spirit. Their medals, now worn with pride, were more than just symbols of bravery. They were symbols of the psychological journey they had undertaken. They were proof that the true heroism was not in the moment of battle, but in the quiet resolve that allowed them to continue the fight. After the war had ended, these men had become not just survivors, conquerors of the hardest battlefield of all, the battlefield of their own doubt. As time passed, the memory of their heroism faded from the front pages of newspapers, but it never left their minds. They lived with the knowledge that they had been given a second chance, not just by their commanders, but by their own resolve. The army had written them off, but they had written their own legacy. And when those who had been too young to fight in the war, or those who had come to know them only through history, looked back on their story, they saw not just soldiers who had returned from the front lines, but men who had proven that even in the most crushing moments of defeat, it is the strength of the will that truly defines a soldier in the years to come. When the echoes of the battlefields of Europe had long since faded, their story would continue to inspire future generations, because the greatest victory they had won was not the defeat of an enemy, but the triumph over the fear and doubt that almost cost them everything. It would take years for them to fully grasp the magnitude of their own transformation. But for those who had known them, who had watched them fight through the darkest moments of their lives, there was no question. The greatest heroes were often the ones who had fallen, but never stopped fighting. The army had told them they were unfit for combat, but what the world would never forget was that These men had returned as something far more powerful than soldiers. They had returned as legends. Their legacy serves as a powerful reminder that the true measure of a hero is not just in the battles they fight, but in the way they rise after being knocked down. And that no matter how many times the world tells us we are unfit, we all have the power to prove the world wrong.